My name is Dana Goldman. I'm the director of the Schaeffer Center for Health Policy and Economics, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to the Dr. Merkin Distinguished Speakers Series webinar, which is hosted by our USC-Brookings Schaeffer Initiative for Health Policy. And today's topic, as you can see, is on paying for cell and gene therapies in Medicare. We're very grateful to Dr. Merkin, whose philanthropic leadership and commitment to improving healthcare helps the Schaeffer Center bring prominent policymakers, experts, and industry leaders together to discuss some of the most pressing problems in healthcare facing the United States. And today, in that vein, I'm really pleased to welcome two distinguished guests, Jeet Guram and Kathy Buto. Not only are they distinguished, by the way, I might add, but they're very pleasant people, which is not always the case when you deal with people in Washington. So I'm especially pleased. Jeet, until quite recently, served as senior advisor to the commissioner of the FDA, where he supported the agency's response to COVID-19. Prior to that, he was a senior advisor to the administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, where he led efforts to modernize payment policies for innovative new therapies and lower prescription drug costs. He has an MD from Harvard Medical School and an MBA from Harvard Business School, and he worked at McKinsey & Company before entering the government. We're also joined by Kathy Buto, an independent consultant who focuses on health policy issues. She's got a broad career that spans both the private and public sectors. Most recently, she was a commissioner on the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission. She's the former vice president for global health policy at Johnson & Johnson, a former senior health advisor at the Congressional Budget Office, and she spent more than 18 years in senior positions at HCFA, which is now CMS. And in all these positions, she headed policy, reimbursement, research, coverage functions at the agency, as well as co-leading Medicare's fee-for-service and managed care organizations. So I can't think of two more accomplished people to discuss these topics. And let me begin just by noting that there are two types of innovation that we worry about at the Schaeffer Center. One is biomedical innovation, getting new treatments to patients. And the other is policy innovation. How do we figure out how to pay for them? And when it comes to discussing cell and gene therapies, those collide. And Medicare's track record on changing the ship, if you will, the policy ship in response to innovation trends is pretty mixed. If you go way back and think about Medicare started in the mid-1960s, and the next decade, President Nixon authorized HMOs, and they entered Medicare as a demonstration project, and they weren't actually enacted into law until the 1997 Balanced Budget Act. So it took 25 years to enshrine HMOs in the Medicare Hall of Fame, so to speak. And we know Part D, it took 40 years to get a prescription drug program. But on the other hand, Medicare has had some successes, and maybe that was from when Kathy was there. In terms of, for example, a good example being the DRG-based policy, where we figured out that fee-for-service was costing a lot, and so we would start to pay prospectively. And so with that backdrop, Jeet, along come Kartik. Can you talk a little bit about how you dealt with that in your experience?
Sure, and thank you, Dana, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction. So the way we dealt with CAR-T was in many ways dictated by what the laws and the regulations required us to do. And it led to real issues with patient access and for many hospitals, inadequate payment for many years. So the first CAR-T cell therapy was approved by the FDA in 2017. It was the first ever gene therapy to be approved in the US. So really a watershed moment in biomedicine there. But the way, and it was initially an inpatient, and it still is a hospital-administered therapy, either inpatient or in some limited cases, hospital outpatient. And so within fee-for-service Medicare, the way a new therapy is paid for is using a DRG-based payment approach. As you mentioned, that's how inpatient cases are paid in Medicare. And the way that works is that at the time of discharge, a patient is assigned to DRG based on their clinical condition and their treatments received, and then Medicare pays a sort of rate for that entire episode of care. For CAR T therapy, the most similar existing DRG was for bone marrow transplants. That was the determination. However, the reimbursement for a bone marrow transplant DRG was on the order of $35,000 to $40,000, whereas the list price for the first CAR T therapy for adults was $373,000. So clearly a huge gap there. And no one was arguing that CAR T therapy was overpriced 10x. The ICER report actually suggested that at its list price, CAR T was, as they determined, within the range of commonly accepted measures of cost effectiveness. So hospitals were left having to try and make up this gap between the DRG amount and their cost. And the way they could do that was using two levers, NTAPs, or new technology add-on payments, and then outlier payments. And those are payments that are made to help, close the gap for new technologies and unpredictably high expenses. But those payment streams were never really designed to cover a therapy that was this much different in cost to anything existing and that had this regular, a high cost associated with it. Another wrinkle was that the money that hospitals drew down from these two payment streams was in some sense based on their charges. So hospitals that set higher charges drew down more money through these payment streams, yet concurrently CMS was requiring hospitals to post their charges and post them in a way that was machine readable. So we were signaling to hospitals that we don't want charges to be that high, we want transparency. So a lot of confusion. After 3 years from the time of approval in 2020, CMS had enough data to establish a new DRG unique to CAR T-cell therapy, and that's currently available. So for now, the crisis is over. Hospitals have a predictable payment stream, but I think the real issue, and what I'm looking forward to discussing in this session, is that this story is really at risk of repeating itself for the next therapy that's a radical departure from available therapies. We don't want to have to go through this really tortuous process again. And so it's time to think about how to pay for really new treatments before we get caught in this position of having to catch up with the science.
Thank you, Jeet. And I think, congratulations on working through the machinery to get people access to this therapy, which we should point out is for people with, it's a specialized cancer treatment for those who don't know. Kathy, but this is not going to be the only treatment that comes along. And how is Medicare prepared to deal with these types of new expensive therapies that are cell and gene based?
Not well. And I think Jeet did a really good job of explaining the fairly torturous DRG approach. One of the issues with DRGs is there's a 2-year lag in data. So even though the new CAR T therapies or like therapies at least have an existing now newly formed DRG for CAR T for blood cancers, it will be imperfect at best in capturing the ongoing costs of new treatments. So I think the question is going to be not just the payment, but does the DRG in inpatient hospital setting provide the right system approach to these kinds of therapies? There may be evolving, or I'm sure someone is thinking of evolving, a different approach, something more like a dialysis center that might be attached to the hospital, because there are obviously serious issues that have to be attended to and followed up on. But right now, a 2-year lag in data makes it difficult. The existing DRG for CAR T will be a bridge for future CAR T therapies, but I don't see an easy way, unless we develop a new carve-out approach or a different kind of delivery approach, for gene and cell therapies to be integrated into a 2-year lagged hospital payment system. So there's that. Secondly, I'll just mention, it hasn't yet become a huge deal, but outpatient treatment with CAR T therapies is probably somewhere down the line. And the question of, again, will these be attached to hospitals? How will the payments be? How will coverage be decided, et cetera? One last thing about the DRG system, it has forced life sciences companies really to come to the table early with data in order to get as early a jump as possible on DRG assignment or reimbursement. Not so true in the outpatient setting. Drugs do have a payment stream, but all the other services are paid more or less a la carte. So I can imagine that going forward, we're going to see much more interest in an outpatient stream for payment purposes.
So, Jeet, just to put some perspective and summarize what I hear from both of you, actually, along comes this therapy, which everyone recognizes is both innovative and, at the way it's priced, quite valuable to society, to these patients. So it's something that we want. We needed to figure out how to reimburse. We did it within the inpatient side. On the inpatient side, the incentives for adopting innovation, if it saves money, are very clear because you're paid prospectively. If you can get people out of the hospital faster, everyone wins. On the other hand, if you come along with something that's valuable that costs money, it is very hard to work it into our current system. On the outpatient side, as Kathy pointed out, if you could do this on the outpatient side, there may be better ways to do it because that's fee for service, but that raises a whole other set of incentives. So, or disincentives, you know, we're back to volume, pay for volume. Is there a solution to work through this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we really looked at two areas closely with respect to what are the levers we have within our statutory authority to try and find a path forward. One was the CMMI model. So of course, you know, within the Affordable Care Act, Congress created the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. And this center is quite powerful to actually waive statute to test new payment approaches within Medicare. And if those approaches are proven successful, they can be scaled across the entire program without having to go through Congress. The issue there, though, is that the statutory criteria for a CMMI model are twofold. First, a model must be either have no impact on quality or improve quality. And then secondly, a model must either be cost neutral or cost savings. Whereas the issue with CAR T was that, and I think it's going to be the case for any cell and gene therapy, is that they do increase spending. However, just because, as you're alluding to in the question, just because something costs more doesn't mean it's not cost effective, doesn't mean it's not good medicine. But the CMMI sort of lever just doesn't really work because it's not a way to increase payment. The other thing we looked at, and that I was really proud that the agency took action on, was the percentage of cost that can be covered by a new technology add-on payment, one of those two payment streams I mentioned that are available to hospitals to help offset the cost of a high-cost episode, including for new technologies. When CAR T was approved, an NTAP could not exceed 50% of the cost of a new technology, which was a completely arbitrary level that was just frankly too low. It's not reasonable to expect hospitals to negotiate that level of discount from a new therapy that doesn't have, and in most cases, will not have competition. So we increased it to 65%. I think the agency should go further. I think around 80% is probably the right amount, and that's within the agency's authority to do that. So I think that's another lever they can look at. One other potential solution to think about, the exact way that this would be achieved is more vague perhaps than the prior two, is that the more CMS can move away from having to set payment levels for every service and move to more of a plan-based approach and Medicare Advantage, the less that issues like this will be apparent. Because we heard through the CAR-T experience that beneficiaries in Medicare Advantage plans were not facing the same challenges with accessing CAR-T cell therapy because MA plans had more flexibility to set their payment parameters as long as they stayed within the capitated amount that Medicare provided. So I think as we see more beneficiaries shifting to MA, we'll get away from a world in which Medicare and fee-for-service has to sort of set a price for each thing and kind of micromanage a plan and allow private insurance companies to work this out in a way that is attractive to their beneficiaries. So those were some of the things we looked at to meet this really urgent challenge.
So, Kathy, I think you just heard Jeet argue that we should have Medicare Advantage for all. And so what do you think? Are you on board with that as well?
Well,
go ahead, say whatever. I'm just
Yeah. Thanks for the opening. Let me just speak to the issue of Medicare Advantage's ability to absorb the cost. I don't think MA plans are well positioned to do that with these kinds of technologies. I mean, it sounds like they've been able to do it. Maybe it's because of the volume. But as we increase the number of gene and cell therapies, I just don't see MA plans being able to do that. And I know that they have the ability to come in and ask for or get add-on payments for breakthrough and new technologies now. And this is a perfect example of where they'd want to get that kind of a payment, which then, of course, begs the question of how do you set that payment add-on? And we're sort of back to where we were. One thing I'd mention is a number of European countries have tried to tackle this in a different way. Many of them have DRG systems, but some of them pay for drugs separately or have different costs bundled into that DRG payment. So in terms of, say, Germany, the UK, and France, they've moved in the direction of outcome-based reimbursement or outcomes-based reimbursement, either coverage with evidence development, where the companies agree to develop post-launch or post-market data that can be used to reassess the pricing of these technologies. And this is something they've done with others, but has really accelerated with CAR-T therapies. I think it's Germany has negotiated a rebate where if the treatment doesn't work for a given patient, the company provides a rebate. And that approach has been used before, but it's obviously a risky one. And I just, from experience, don't think a lot of companies are going to want to pursue that. But outcomes-based reimbursement is something that ought to be looked at for Medicare. It's possible to carve out something more targeted that will also stimulate more data development and analysis post introduction and post reimbursement. And actually, Jeet, I'd be interested to know whether that's something you think FDA and CMS could engage in jointly. I think there's already joint enterprise going on with the phase 4 studies between the two agencies. For something like CAR-T, it just seems to me a natural fit.
Sure. So if I could respond on that, it's a great point. And you're exactly right, Kathy. The agencies are working together in sort of a phase 4 context. So in the summer, today, so far we've been talking about payment issues pertaining to CAR-T. There's also issues that CMS faced around coverage of CAR-T. What indications, what kind of evidence do we need? Because at the time of approval of CAR-T, the data was limited in outcomes in the senior population, which is typical for a new drug, that manufacturers typically come to FDA with data on how their product performed in younger, healthier individuals, and there may not be much data at the time of approval on how a drug worked in the senior population. So in fact, the collaboration with FDA actually informed where we landed on CMS's own coverage determination for this product. So in the summer of 2019, CMS issued a coverage determination for CAR-T, and the agency decided to cover the therapy for on-label indications and indications that were included in CMS-approved compendia, while concurrently working with FDA to get data on how the drug was performing in different patients and over a long-term follow-up. Because the FDA had requirements on these manufacturers for continued data tracking because of the particular approval pathways that were used for CAR-T. As a new therapy, the FDA was willing to approve it, based on perhaps less data than would have been the case for other approvals without these advantages, under the condition that the manufacturers continue to report data into the agency. So what CMS said is, we'll cover the product, but we're going to work with FDA to keep an eye on the same data they're tracking over the long term, and we may amend our coverage parameters based on what that data indicates. The one other point I would just follow up on briefly, Kathy made a really good point that MA plans do, of course, get a risk-adjusted payment for every beneficiary, which in the case of something like CAR-T would include additional payments for a new therapy. And so in some respect, we are back where we started with the NTAPs and so forth. But I think in an important respect, we're not, in that for a Medicare Advantage plan, CMS has one decision to make: how much to pay per Benny in that plan. What does the risk adjustment flow out to be? And then plans can test many ways to set coverage and provide care to those bennies, provide coverage. Whereas in fee-for-service, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions for each widget, each service, and a lot of opportunities to get things wrong and pay either inadequately or in excess. So it is still a challenge, but it's a singular challenge as opposed to a really myriad set of challenges.
Yeah, I think I want to follow up on that, Jeet, because I do think it's a remarkably important point that the Medicare Advantage side may be a better place to work with this. And think about these technologies. Some people think of them as drugs, and some people think of them as procedures, and they have elements of both. They're similar to drugs in that there's a lot of IP that goes into developing them, and you want to reward the innovator, and they have some monopoly power on the drug side. But usually the way we deal with that is we protect it for a little bit, and then we hope that generics and biosimilars will eventually bring costs down. Here you're talking about an innovation, but it also has expensive procedural component. You've got to do it in a clinical settings, and right now often in hospitals, and that's expensive, and there's manufacturing that's expensive. So it's high cost. And so we're not going to have the opportunity to save money, to expand access and save money on the back end by just saying there's a biosimilar. So what are we going to be able to do to, and Kathy, you talked about, for example, I think specialized hospital outpatient clinics, and Medicare Advantage is well situated to contract in those cases.
Yeah, I agree with that, Dana. I will just, as a side note, though, mention that until Medicare Advantage's payment rates are set more competitively, it is a bigger bundle of payment, but not perfect yet, not really reflective of what the market will bear for, the cost of the Medicare package. So I think that's an important step that has to be taken down the road. The evolution of CAR-T and whether, I think you rightly point out, the opportunity for biosimilars is not there, but there may be other opportunities to sort of develop a more, I hate to use the word generic, but a more standardized approach that will bring some costs down. Since it is a series of steps, very expensive and customized steps that have to be taken to provide the treatment, there may be ways within that to, over time, bring costs down. But I think for us to expect that will happen quickly is just not realistic. So you're right. I think that's going to be a challenge going forward. One thing I'll mention about different approaches to payment is, this is something that seems to me CMS Medicare needs to get on top of. It sounds like a lot of work has already been done, Jeet, but CMMI is the perfect place to try some of these different reimbursement approaches, working with health centers and organized health systems. I'd like to see that happen sooner rather than later, because I think until then, the DRG system of reimbursement is the way this has to proceed. And Jeet pointed out how, I guess, clunky in a way, the cost to charge ratio portion of the DRG payment really, it creates this incentive for the hospitals to set charges high in a transparency environment in order to get anything they consider to be close to the cost of providing the treatment. And I think that's a distortion that we need to take on and figure out whether there needs to be a different cost to charge ratio for certain categories of new products or breakthrough technologies. So I don't know, but I think that's a real problem with the DRG system.
Yes, Kathy, you summarized those issues much clearer than I did. The cost to charge ratio, the strange incentives that introduces. And we did look at the agency at changing the cost to charge ratio. That is a lever that's within CMS's statutory authority. There are just a lot of downstream consequences that could flow from that. Because the cost to charge ratio is lower than 1 now, some suggested the CMS should have set it at 1 or closer to 1 for CAR-T. But just as the current cost to charge ratio introduces perverse incentives, just paying charges would get us back to the world that Dana was mentioning before the days of DRG, and we'd just be, passing through payment, and no one wants that either. So all of these levers and dials are very tricky to get just right. The one point I would add on the question of how do we get to an affordable or, a lower cost end state for some of these new gene therapies for which we can't realistically expect biosimilar competition, I think the role of branded competition should not be discounted. That, Novartis was the first out the gate with a CAR-T product, but not too long after that, Yescarta, now Gilead, had a product, and we're hearing about many other products in development. There may have even been more that have gotten FDA approval. I haven't been following the space as closely in the most recent months, but I think branded competition could introduce meaningful competition as well, because I agree, biosimilar versions of these products are not something that, for a number of issues that we need to address, but for the current state, that's not something that we can rely on in the near term.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize costs are coming down. And, we went through this with Hep C when the price first came out with Sovaldi. There was a lot of hand-wringing, and people thought that this showed a market failure. But actually, prices fell quite dramatically as branded competition entered the market. And some of the original projections that caused a lot of the scare of spending hundreds of billions in a single year on the therapy never materialized, because we know there's price pressure if you can get competitive forces into the market. It's very hard to do that generally in Medicare. If you're, especially with, for example, some of the fee-for-service and hospital-related products, but that's why I think your managed competition idea around Medicare Advantage is a good one, although I will add Kathy's caveat that Medicare Advantage is not primed well to pay for expensive new technology. But that's where the value-based contracting comes in, which is no one, I think, wants to move to a world where we pay whatever we can for expensive new technologies of uncertain efficacy. The challenge is, what do we do about expensive technologies when they do have certain efficacy? And now I'm going to get that's my segue to the question, Q&A. Feel free to submit. Stephen Tooch, who's a senior fellow in the center and does a lot of work on social determinants of health, has asked, can we really afford any of this? You know, should we be spending it on preventive services and the like? And how do we balance that in the Medicare program? Kathy, I'll start with you.
I think it's a great question. And actually, I would even say, not only can we afford it vis-a-vis preventive care, there is a bullseye right now on pharmaceutical pricing. And it's both in the administration and both administrations really, and in Congress as well. So I think there will be an increased effort, not just around the fringes of Part D and Part B, but looking at these kinds of therapies. And I personally would not be surprised if the issue of a health technology assessment, NICE-like entity comes up again. It's something that the med tech industry, pharmaceutical industry has really not wanted to see, because it's sort of the idea of a single entity making judgments about the value or the cost effectiveness of new technologies. But this is, if ever there was a poster child for that kind of entity, this might be it. Right now, it doesn't break the surface so much in terms of that being a threat, because there are relatively few patients involved. I think once we get to therapies that can treat many, many more people for given conditions, other gene therapies, I think that that pressure will increase. So that's my take on it. And in terms of preventive services, Medicare has been pretty lousy about covering prevention. And in fact, if you just take chronic disease, in getting a handle on doing basic preventive measures with individuals in the Medicare program with multiple chronic diseases, except through MA plans. So there are big challenges there that need to be addressed. And yes, this is the shiny new object that causes one to look away, but I think those are issues that I think your colleague rightly brings up, need to be addressed.
Jeet?
Yep, I agree. I think we need more incentives for manufacturers to develop treatments to better manage chronic disease. That there's a much higher burden of disease from chronic illness than from these rare cancers and orphan diseases, for which a lot of the new cell and gene therapies are being developed. So I think we need better incentives and better payment for preventive care and for treatments for chronic disease. However, I do think it's sort of worth pointing out that Medicare doesn't really operate in a sort of zero-sum way, that if more money goes towards a new therapy, that's money away from preventive care. Maybe it should operate in a more zero-sum approach so that there was some sense of, global accounting for costs. But right now, of course, most of these drugs for chronic diseases are retail prescription drugs you get at a pharmacy that are paid through Part D. And then many of these new cell and gene therapies are going to be paid either in a inpatient or outpatient hospital in Part A or B. So it's not really a zero sum. And I think the other point to make is that for many of these, for really all of the new cell and gene therapies that have been approved to date, when you think about total spending, it's both price and quantity. And the price, of course, of these new therapies is very high, over, exceeding $1 million per dose for at least one of the new gene therapies that's been approved. But the quantity so far has been quite low. That could change. But to date, it's such that in aggregate, these therapies are not going to bankrupt the Medicare Trust Fund any more than it's already bankrupted, frankly. As one example of that, when we did increase the NTAP percentage from 50% to 65%, it was a really challenging change to make, to get everyone within the administration on board, to get the right ducks in a row, as with any change. But if you look in our rule, we only projected an increase in inpatient spending of $110 million over the next year from that change. And when you're sitting at CMS, you almost never see a policy whose costs or savings are expressed in terms of millions. It's always at least single digit, if not more, billions that you're throwing around. The agency spends $1.3 trillion a year. So for these therapies, I think we're rightly wanting to economize. We are aware that the trust fund is going bankrupt fast, but it just doesn't make sense to me to pinch pennies on therapies that are known to have a life-saving impact in some patients with serious diseases, refractory cancers. When we're talking about millions of dollars on the hook, obviously we want to create incentives for pharma to set competitive prices, and we want to be a prudent purchaser, but we have to keep the bigger picture in mind. And if a cancer patient needs a therapy, we want to do what we can to not stand in the way of that.
So we did those are important points. Part of what we do at our center with support from the National Institute on Aging is we've looked at medical technologies. And you're absolutely right that, for the patients for whom these things are tested, the ones that diffuse and disseminate into clinical practice, the initial population, they're clearly beneficial. And this gets back to kind of the evaluations. What tends to happen with these technologies is they expand use and they end up in marginal populations where it's not always so clear. And I think the challenge for Medicare has always been that it's not thumbs up or thumbs down. It's how do we make sure the right patient is getting the right treatment? And, that's kind of what a Medicare Advantage plan brings it back to. But I want to come back to something Kathy said, because she talked about a technology assessment. And we're going to have another panel on that topic for sure. We can't do it justice here. But I do think it's not fair to say that the manufacturers are necessarily opposed to that. In fact, I think part of the complaint has been that the people who are doing evaluation right now focus exclusively on a zero-sum game of the sort that Jeet is talking about. And there's a lot of evidence for value that it doesn't get incorporated into it. And actually, COVID has highlighted that quite a bit, because we see that our willingness, because of the economic consequences and the disparities and the like, our willingness to pay is much higher than what you would suggest if someone did a standard economic analysis. But I'm going to put that one aside as a topic for another day. We're getting some excellent questions coming through, and I want to get to them. One question is about NTAPs, and it says it's a great bridge to access for new drugs, but they're time limited. What are the options for post-NTAP, especially if the drugs are going to be used across multiple DRGs?
Well, maybe I could take that, and I'm sure Jeet has even more recent experience with this, but the options post NTAP are that, first of all, the agency has enough data to look at what reimbursement category within the DRG system best suits that technology, given pricing and practice and so on. The other is, in the case of CAR T, what's happened is they created a unique DRG. And I think that's good, because it turns out that DRG is the highest weighted DRG in the whole DRG system. So it is, it couldn't easily, it was in autologous bone marrow transplant, but couldn't easily fit into anything else. Even with newer data, it would have overpaid for many of those other treatments that are within the existing DRG. So that makes sense. Those are two options. I think what we're talking about here is, should there be, is that quick enough? And it sounds like the 3-year bridge is sustainable now with something like this, because the percentage was raised to 65%. I think it would have been tough at 50% for the 3 years. So, but Jeet, you've got more recent experience, and I'm sure can speak to this too.
Yes, no, thank you, Kathy. Not a whole lot more to add, really, except that the question highlights to me that perhaps the CAR T story was even more alarming than I thought it was, because it just so happened with CAR T that right when the NTAP was expiring, the agency felt it had enough data to establish a DRG and had that. And we actually got there were a lot of panicked meetings over CAR T. And right around the time I was leaving the agency, they were around this very point of, what if you don't have enough data to establish a DRG, you're not ready to establish a DRG? Are you going to stretch the NTAP out more? What are you going to do? And, we were really focused on getting to that DRG and felt comfortable, the agency felt comfortable proposing and then finalizing it. It's really credit, as with everything that goes well at CMS, to the extraordinary staff there and the diligence of their efforts. But I think had that not been the case, and it might not be the case for the next, gene therapy that gets approved, we'll face even more access challenges.
Great. So I think we have 5 minutes left, and I'm getting a lot of Q&A that are coming through about national technology assessment. I just want to we will be doing we'll do another event on that topic. I got my start in health economics in the early 90s for writing a report for the Office of Technology Assessment on treatments for Gaucher's disease. And right after I wrote my report, they closed the office. I'm not saying that's causal, but
it wasn't.
But I want to give you, both of you, in the last few minutes, do you have one policy that you would promote now, sitting where you have some independence, that you think could accelerate access to both new technologies, but also technologies that already exist that we're not using enough of, like drugs? Who would like to go first?
I can go
Okay.
off the bat. So, I think that a lot of how we look at health policy in the coming year or years is going to be colored by COVID. I know it already is for me. But one sort of thing that seems to have gone well with the government's response has been the way that the government has acquired high priority therapeutics and vaccines directly from manufacturers and then distributed them. First for remdesivir when the supply was limited, then for monoclonal antibodies, and finally, of course, for vaccines. And I don't see why Congress couldn't establish a similar pathway for really innovative cell and gene therapies. Just pull them entirely out of the system of hospitals having to buy them, bill, worry about the cash flow issues of spending all this money and having a product that you may or may not get to use, may or may not get paid for. It's just not a productive use of time for our healthcare system. So for patients in government programs, in Medicare especially, I don't think there would be benefits to doing this for all patients, as we've done in COVID, whether you're in a private plan or what have you. The government's been purchasing the therapies and the vaccines. But I think having some new stream of acquisition by CMS, by HHS, and then distribution would just be more appropriate, given how innovative and how challenging these products are to acquire and pay for.
One nice advantage of that, by the way, and Kathy, sorry, is just that we would know how much we're paying for innovation and what fraction of our budget is going to that. And it's a societal decision. How much do we want to set aside to reward innovation? Anyway, very intriguing idea. Kathy, you get the last word.
I like that idea. The UK has something like that for cancer, a cancer fund. And of course, imagine all the difficulties in setting up such an innovation fund, including the competition for funds, negotiation of prices, and so on and so forth. But I think it's a terrific idea. I think it may be a bridge, could be time limited in such a way that it would be contingent on evidence development, et cetera. I just want to say one thing, though, Dana, because behind your question was a premise that innovation is a good thing. And I think important innovation that advances treatment is a good thing. But I actually, when the NTAP was first introduced, I was very much opposed to it. And the reason is I was fearful that it would be really a leakage out of the DRG system. One of the benefits of DRGs was over time, the 2-year lag. So it actually forced trade-offs at the level of hospitals. And the one I cite is the trade-off between bypass surgery and angioplasty, where we actually overpaid for angioplasty for a couple of years, but it gave us a better insight as to the relative value that angioplasty brought. And then TPA, which is a thrombolytic therapy for heart attack, where there was a lot of pressure to pay separately. We didn't do that. There wasn't a mechanism to do that. And it turned out later that its use reduced inpatient stays significantly, more than making up for the cost of the treatment. So just a word of caution that sometimes it doesn't make sense to create a separate pathway for new innovation. It will find its own way. This is an exception to that for sure, because I think it's groundbreaking, and it will, game change, really, treatment approaches.
Well, I think what we can all, coming back, thank you both. And coming back, I get to say the prerogative of the last word, coming back to how Jeet started saying he had to work years on this issue. I think we all can agree that earlier access to innovative products with evidence development that will ultimately inform an intelligent payment policy based on value would make eminent sense for this program. And we all can be working towards that. And that's the final word. I want to thank both of you. As I said, it's always a pleasure to work with you and appreciate your time, and thank the audience for their excellent questions. You've gave us some ideas. We need to have some more events on these topics. Take care, everyone.